As the temps start rising, I feel the familiar urge to refresh my closet, but I don't want to waste money on pieces I'll only wear once or for just one season. Thankfully, Quince changes that. Their clothes are timeless, lightweight, and far more elevated than anything else at this price. It finally feels like my wardrobe matches my standards. The best part is that Quince only works with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing practices and premium fabrics and finishes, so you get to look good while feeling good. I'm pretty excited that I have upgraded my athleisure wardrobe for this summer. I bought a sweatshirt and a pair of wide-leg flow pants that are two of the softest items I own, and I plan to live in them. So join me in giving your summer closet an upgrade with Quince. Go to quince.com/POTC for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/POTC to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/POTC.
There is a psychological disorder associated with it, but it really needs to be understood primarily as a crime because it needs to center the harm that is done to the children.
The legal definition of abuse is knowing right from wrong when you're committing the crime. And these offenders demonstrate that ability over and over and over again through just the planned pattern of abuse that they have with their children.
That was Andrea Dunlop and Mike Weber on Psychologists Off the Clock.
We are 5 experts in psychology here to bring you cutting-edge and science-based ideas to help you flourish in your relationships, work, and health.
I'm Dr. Debbie Sorensen, a clinical psychologist practicing in Mile High, Denver, Colorado, and author of Act for Burnout, Act Daily Journal, and the Act Daily Card Deck.
From America's Heartland, I'm Dr. Emily Edlin, a clinical psychologist based in Chicago, Illinois, and author of Autonomy Supportive Parenting.
I'm Yael Schoenbrunn, a clinical psychologist, faculty at Brown University, author of Work, Parent Thrive, and a biweekly newsletter on relationships.
Calling in from Vienna, Austria, I'm Michael Herold, ACT coach, confidence trainer, and author of an upcoming book on being a better conversationalist and making friends.
And from coastal New England, I'm Dr. Jill Stoddard, author of Be Mighty, The Big Book of ACT Metaphors, and Imposter No More.
We hope you take what you learn here to build a rich and meaningful life.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock.
Hey everybody, it's Jill here, and I have Emily with me to sort of introduce today's episode with Andrea Dunlop and Mike Weber, but we are actually going to do a little experiment and shift our usual intro to do something different. Emily, do you want to tell our listeners what's what?
Sure. So we thought this would be a good opportunity to do something we've been talking about, and we're calling it a debrief of the episode rather than an introduction. And this came up because I have years of experience in medical child abuse and sexual abuse, that it would actually have better context if we talked about it after all of you listened to the discussion.
So stay tuned to the end and you can hear Emily and I in our very first POTC debrief at the end of the episode.
And a quick heads up, today's episode includes adult themes, as I mentioned, including sexual abuse.
Hey everybody, it's Jill here, and I am so excited. We have Andrea Dunlop and Mike Weber with us today. Andrea was here for episode 314 with Mark Feldman, and she's back today with Mike because they've written a terrific new book, The Mother Next Door, Medicine, Deception, and Munchausen by Proxy. Andrea Dunlop is the author of 4 novels, including She Regrets Nothing and Women Are the Fiercest Creatures, both of which I've read and loved. And she's the host and creator of Nobody Should Believe Me, an award-winning investigative true crime podcast about Munchausen by Proxy that all of us at POTC absolutely love. Andrea is the founder of Munchausen Support, the nation's only nonprofit dedicated to supporting survivors and families affected by MBP, and a member of the American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children's MBP Committee, where she serves alongside the country's foremost experts. She lives in Seattle with her husband and 2 children. Mike Weber has 40 years of law enforcement experience, including 15 years as a crimes against children investigator. Detective Weber has consulted with numerous police agencies and district attorneys' offices nationally on cases of medical child abuse and was awarded the 2016 NCMEC Texas Hero for Children Award. He currently lives and works in Fort Worth. So Andrea, welcome back to POTC, and Mike, welcome to POTC. I'm so excited to talk with you both today.
Oh, we're excited to be here, Jill. It's so nice to be a returning guest on this fabulous show.
I love it. We love our returning guests at POTC. So full transparency for the listeners, when Andrea and Mike's book came out, we at POTC really wanted to support them. We love the work they're doing. We believe in the work they're doing. Well, we want to help spread the word. But we also weren't totally sure there'd be enough new information for another full POTC episode that was dedicated to this niche of Munchausen by proxy. So we brainstormed a little bit about the angle we could take that would still be new and interesting and helpful to listeners. And so what we came up with is an episode that's mostly focused around the tendency of so many loved ones in an alleged perpetrator's life being willing to turn a blind eye to support and defend an abuser, an alleged abuser, no matter what, even when the evidence is incredibly compelling. And how we see this pattern not only with medical child abuse, which is typically perpetrated by women, by mothers, but also with child sexual abuse, which is typically perpetrated by men and is often compared to Munchausen by proxy. So that's the angle that we're going to take today. So for anyone who wants to learn in more detail about Munchausen by proxy, if this is new to you, you can go back and listen to episode 314. And of course, I highly recommend Mike and Andrea's book. It is an incredibly fascinating read, goes into detail about several families and everything that occurred with them. And then, of course, Andrea's podcast, which Mike is featured on, Nobody Should Believe Me, is an incredible resource too. Okay, so with all of that, let's get started. Even though we're not going to talk a whole lot about this, let's at least do a real quick refresher. Andrea, will you just remind our audience, what is Munchausen by proxy?
Yeah, absolutely. So Munchausen by proxy is the term that we use to describe two sort of separate but intertwined things. And I always think this is great to sort of have this framing up front. So it's both the act of medical child abuse, which is where a parent or caregiver, as you said, Jill, usually a mother, like 96% of known cases are mothers, induces, exaggerates, or fabricates an illness in their child. So that is the behavior, right? That is the actual crime. And then on the psychological side, the diagnosis of factitious disorder imposed on another is when a person does those things for the purposes of sympathy and attention. MBP is used basically interchangeably to describe those two things. And as Mike can attest, that is sort of one of the central challenges of these cases and impedes definitely the understanding on the public side about what this is and how it should be addressed. You know, one of the questions that both Mike and I get the most is Munchausen by proxy a mental illness? And the way that I answer that actually has sort of shifted and become a bit more definitive over time, to which at this point I would say no. There is a psychological disorder associated with it, but it really needs to be understood primarily as a crime because it needs to center the harm that is done to the children, and the psychiatric disorder that underlies the behavior in no way lessens a person's culpability for committing this act. So it's not something where it's like would be part of an insanity plea. So I think the psychiatric diagnosis needs to be mostly separate from how we understand how this act happens, and then also sort of how it plays out in court.
Well, and also from a legal perspective, just because something is in the DSM, just because there is a psychological diagnosis doesn't mean that invalidates it as a crime, right? There's a different legal standard for sanity than there is, say, in the DSM. I assume. I am not a psychologist, but I would assume. For example, pedophilia is in the DSM. We prosecute those offenders every single day. Pedophilia has been in there since 1952. This abuse has been in there since 2013. Some people think it shouldn't be in there. I know Dr. Feldman has spoken out that he feels it's not supposed to be. It should not be in the DSM and should be just classified as abusive behavior. The legal definition of abuse is knowing right from wrong when you're committing the crime. And these offenders demonstrate that ability over and over and over again through just the planned pattern of abuse that they have with their children. And when I interview them, it's the same interview like with any other offender in any other type of child abuse crime. They first lie, hit them with some additional facts, and they'll change their story to try to conform. And then you may get admissions, but you'll never get the entire truth. And from a behavior perspective, they're really no different than the other child abuse offender.
Yeah, so that is exactly what I was thinking is, well, you know, we have a category of paraphilias in the DSM, which is pedophilia, but that doesn't make sexual abuse any less of a crime, because Munchausen's and child sexual abuse are frequently compared. So are there some other ways, like help our listeners understand how we think about these two things as having some similarities? Because on the surface, they don't seem to be the same.
Well, from my experience with this, you have the manipulation of adults around the child in order to gain access to the child. In sexual abuse, it's to commit sexual crimes. In this abuse, it's to medically abuse the child or further the abuse. And those adults, usually in sexual abuse, are parents or guardians of the child or who's ever taken care of the child. In this abuse, it's the legal community, it's the medical community, it's family members. It is much wider, actually, than it is in sexual abuse.
Yeah. Well, that's grooming, right? You're essentially describing grooming,
Yes.
and that might not be a word that comes to mind for people when it comes to Munchausen by proxy, but that's exactly what they're doing.
When a child learns the only way to get love is to play the sick role, they're going to play the sick role as they get older. So you have that grooming of them into actually participating in the abuse. And those are the hardest cases to try to separate when they get to the teen years. And this has been going on forever.
Yeah. And just to weigh in about those similarities, I think also the, elements of extremely strong taboo and shame around these. And I think, especially as we are sort of zeroing in on that element of why do the people in the child's life who are not the abusive parent often, unfortunately, support the perpetrator's story? Why do they cover for them? Why are they not convinced when they're presented with extremely clear and compelling evidence? I think that the emotional landscape around this abuse is just extraordinarily overpowering. It's a thing that you don't want to believe that someone that you love and trust could be capable of. And so people will do the most extraordinary mental gymnastics to believe something else, right? That there's a conspiracy by the doctors or, what have you. And so I think just how resistant people are to accepting it. And I think the grooming is a word that we're starting to use more actually with regards to Munchausen by proxy cases, because it is so intense. And I can speak to this being a family member, is that the pot that you're being boiled in for years and years when you're in one of these offenders' lives, right? Where you're being gaslit. And I mean gaslighting in the true sense where someone is systematically trying to get you to doubt your perception of reality. And that's a very intense experience to be in as a person who's close to one of these cases. And so I think that is a grooming behavior. They're setting up the entire community to doubt their own eyes, right? One of the things that we're beginning to appreciate as we are with the community in Munchausen support and with some of other colleagues on the committee are really starting to appreciate about, the story, given the stories that we hear from survivors, is how intense the psychological abuse and the emotional abuse is in these cases. And that's what Mike was speaking to of these children are taught that the way they will get love and approval is by acting sick in front of other people, is by towing the family line and towing these stories. And so, especially when they are old enough to sort of understand, for instance, with very young kids, right? And this is interesting because the case of this season, and I won't give too much away, but in looking at some of the forensic interviews with these children, if they're younger, they're not going to know exactly sort of how to toe the line. So I think it's more obvious that there isn't that the symptoms are fabricated because the kid doesn't know how to uphold the story. But it gets a lot more complicated when the kid is older and they may have some awareness that they're lying, but they're being told that lying is the thing they need to do. Because they're being given a narrative, they're not saying yeah, this is a lie and mommy needs this because she needs attention. Obviously they're not being told that, but what they're being told is something along the lines of, you have to make sure to tell doctors that you are sick. You have to cough when we're in there. You have to do XYZ and tell them XYZ because you really are sick. And if the doctors don't believe you, then you will die. And so they're being told this very complicated story. So they're not lying. The kids aren't lying on purpose, right? But they're just being
they're being manipulated.
They're being manipulated really, really deeply. And it's it's an all day, everyday thing. I mean, I think that's the thing that's so damaging about this abuse is there's no reprieve from it. And these parents really, they are so intensely controlling that they will cut out anybody who starts to doubt their story, which is another thing I think you see. The reason you see people, carrying that water for the perpetrator is because they know that they're going to be cut out of the child's life if they don't. case in point, my family. And also moving along from doctors that won't do what they want and just really like controlling every piece of the child's life, from what sports they can participate in, whether or not they go to school. We see a lot of parents pulling their kids out of school and homeschooling them, like every element from which friends they can be around to which family members they can see, just absolute control over everything.
Well, there's two things that come to mind for me there. And one is that these perpetrators most of them are really good at what they do, whether it's sexual abuse, whether it's Munchausen's, medical child abuse. There's one story in the book of a person who was a terrible liar, and she was not very sophisticated at getting away with this, but a lot of times they are very convincing, very sophisticated liars, very manipulative. And so the people who are buying this hook, line, and sinker, it's not so much because you're dumb. It's that you're believing what you're being told by someone who's very skilled at gaslighting or whatever it is. The other thing that comes to mind when you were talking about the grooming is the ways in which, I'm thinking about episode 19. It was very early on with the podcast with Feather Burkauer called Keeping Children Safe from Sexual Abuse. And she talked all about grooming. And one of the things she talks about is that the abuser will tell the child to keep a secret, right? So let's say it's a babysitter and they'll say, okay, your mom and dad said you're not allowed to have any ice cream, but I'm going to let you have ice cream, but it's going to be our little secret. Don't tell. And it's a test. So then if the parent calls the babysitter and says, hey, I told you not to give my kid ice cream. What were you doing? That person knows this is not a kid that I should abuse because that kid tells the secret, right? They do this as a test. And if you're a kid that keeps secrets, I'm more likely to get away with the abuse with you. And it sounds a little bit similar to what you're talking about. Oh, this is a doctor who isn't buying what I'm selling, so I'll just go to a different doctor. I'll sell my sob story on Facebook in this mom's group to these friends. And if they're questioning me, I'm going to excommunicate them and put my focus elsewhere. Does that sound right?
Oh, 100%. And I think one thing that Mike and I deal with a lot is people looking at these cases and being like, well, why doesn't someone prosecute the doctors who did these things, who did these surgeries that were unnecessary, et cetera? And it's a nuanced question because, by and large, if doctors are doing procedures and tests, et cetera, in good faith based on false parent reports, then those doctors don't have any culpability for that, right? Like doctors, pediatric doctors do the vast majority of their work based on parent reports, much less of it based on sort of like black and white diagnostic testing, right? So that's one thing. But there are doctors who are a real problem in these cases. And boy, are these offenders good at finding them. And they speak to each other. There are forums that are extremely geared towards offenders. MitoAction.org is one we've talked about on the podcast with sort of these like mito diagnosis. And there's lots of advice on that website about how to, quote, avoid false accusations of medical child abuse. So, I've come across several of these groups where it really looks to me like offenders are trading information, right? And so they find, another one is like when we talked about the Maya Kowalski case in season 3, that was the Take Care of Maya case. Beata Kowalski got Dr. Kirkpatrick's name from another parent of a child who allegedly has this thing. And she just said, like, go to Dr. Kirkpatrick. I'm paraphrasing a bit, but the, communications that were released in the public record, it was basically this parent saying like, Beata Kowalski saying, I can't get this diagnosis that I'm looking for. And another parent saying, go to Dr. Kirkpatrick. He will give you the diagnosis. So there are these doctors that will just give a diagnosis to every kid who walks through the door. And now, whether that's because they are making money off of it, that is certainly a factor. Dr. Kirkpatrick famously runs, and I say famously, like everyone knows as much about this case as I do, famously in my own brain, runs, an all-cash clinic, right? So I think money is a motivator in some cases, or because they are sort of so fixated on that diagnosis and that is the thing they've kind of built their career around. So they just sort of have blinders on. That is another element. Some of these doctors really do not believe that Munchausen by proxy / medical child abuse is a real phenomenon. So of course, they're not going to see it when every parent who's walking through their door is an offender. So it is a very, very compulsive behavior, and they are absolutely relentless in getting what they want. And that is the commonality, really. you were talking about Brittany Phillips, which is a case that we've covered on the show, and that is one of our cases in the books, who was not highly skilled, right? She wasn't highly intelligent. She wasn't a master manipulator, which some of the offenders we've talked about are, but she was equally as relentless about getting what she wanted. So it's like she was just we called her the sort of blunt force instrument, right? So, and also they just take advantage of all of the problems within our medical system. How, like people, I think, sometimes think, oh, with electronic records, now everybody's connected. Like, unfortunately, no, that is not how that works. There are like two different major programs and, it's this late stage capitalism, baby. So they're competing and they don't necessarily, everyone doesn't have access to things. So they really take advantage of sort of all of those flaws in
and
the
doctors
system.
Don't have time. They're seeing back to back to back to back patients, 7 minutes each.
Mm-hmm.
And as you guys point out with these MVP cases, their medical records are thousands and thousands of pages long, which that in its own right should be a red flag. If, a child has 700 pages of medical records.
Like, that is one of the things that I was, my 5-year-old niece had no diagnosed chronic condition, no real diagnosed chronic condition. She had 73,000 pages of medical records at 5 years old. Yeah.
So shouldn't that alone be a huge red flag? But I guess when people don't have paper records anymore and you're just pulling up, I don't know what it even is. I'm not a medical doctor, but maybe they don't even know that there's 75,000 pages because that's not apparent when you're just kind of looking at the patient walking in the door.
Yeah. I mean, and it's not until those records are subpoenaed that they have any knowledge. And like, yeah, as you said.
And Andrea, that's if we know where all they have been. Mm-hmm. They have that information. We have to get that information from them. And there's ways to do that. And basically, you present yourself as non-threatening and just let them talk. And they're used to fooling people. And you hope they'll tell you everything. A lot of times they will. But if they have been, for instance, diagnosed somewhere that's not on, like, say, Epic medical records that the hospital that I deal with uses, we're not going to know that. And we're not going to know that someone else has diagnosed medical child abuse and they left and went somewhere else unless they tell us they've been there, or unless we can find it in some sort of medical record from another facility.
Hey everybody, it's Jill here, and I am super excited to announce that I will be speaking at one of the largest and truly most inspiring and meaningful psychotherapy conferences we have here in the U.S., the Psychotherapy Networker Conference. Other speakers include Esther Perel, John Kabat-Zinn, Ramani Durvasula, David Kessler, and so many more. I am just thrilled and honored to be among this esteemed faculty. The conference is being held March 20th to the 23rd in Washington, D.C., and if you register now, you can get early bird rates and save up to 40%. Plus, you can get an additional $50 off when you use the code SYM50. That's SYM50. So go to our website, offtheclockpsych.com, and click on our books and offers page and register today.
Mike, there were so many just frustrating examples in the book of, spouses, friends, family, like we talked about, but even judges and other officials really turning a blind eye to this type of abuse, even when there's really compelling evidence. Like, Mike, do you want to give us a couple examples, like experiences that you've had in law enforcement with this? And then let's talk about like, what is going on? Like, why do people not even believe that this is a true diagnosis when we see that it follows a really similar pattern every single time? Like, what is it going to take to get people on board with this?
Well, and I understand people who just don't have the knowledge. What I don't understand is a hostility to learning, which is currently what exists at my district attorney's office with the current administration in place. The chief prosecutor in that office told me that doctors should be reviewing all medical records of the child before they ever treat the child. And I asked her, are we going to wait 3 months to treat the child? What if the child dies? Or now the doctor's liable? What are you going to do? Well, you should do it before that. It shouldn't get that far. Okay, you're the arbitrator of medical records. When? Right? And she attacked me in the training I gave saying I should be charging doctors, which is, look, if a doctor's mentally culpable for a crime, I have no problem charging a doctor. But if they have no mental culpability, if they are just relying on the history of mom, I mean, what are you going to do? As far as family court judges go, the last 2 articles published in the Juvenile and Family Court Journal on this abuse were published in 1990. Don't know what it is. They have little time. They don't want to listen to it. They don't understand the severity. And they just, I'm not going to deal with it. It's easier just to give the kid back to mom and move along. What they don't understand is these offenders are extremely compulsive. Once they get that verification from the court, and a lot of these advanced offenders, that even makes that compulsion even more. Now they fooled someone else that they get a psychological thrill out of, and they continue on their path. That's another similarity with pedophilia is a compulsion in these offenders, especially the advanced offenders in this abuse. They do not stop their abuse. Just had a recent case where after she pled guilty and was out on bond awaiting a pre-sentencing investigative report, she continued to poison additional children twice. I arrested her once for a bond violation, and the prosecution did nothing. They didn't ask for a bond hearing. They didn't ask the judge to revoke her bond, didn't even put her on her ankle monitor. And she was an attractive, mid-30s female, and that can go a long way in court. Yeah. When an offender doesn't look threatening to you, Andrea says it great on the podcast all the time. People believe their eyes. And when you have someone with no criminal or a minor criminal history who just doesn't look like a threat to you, you're not going to take that threat seriously.
I think what boggles my mind the most, though, that all totally makes sense, except then when I think about the fact that you're prioritizing a potential perpetrator over a child, a vulnerable, powerless child, that aren't they the ones who should be getting the benefit of the doubt before? So I had this experience, and I don't know that I've ever talked about this publicly, but we were away on vacation with a large group of people. And because I had listened to that episode with Feather Burkauer that I had mentioned, I had all this new knowledge about what grooming looks like. And there was an individual that was invited that wasn't supposed to be coming on this trip. It was somebody's adult stepson. And I proceeded to watch him groom my 6-year-old daughter. However, I didn't know if I should trust my own eyes because I actually had a family member who had been recently caught for having child sex abuse material on his computer. And so I was in a bad headspace and I thought, it's just me. I'm being paranoid. I'm probably not seeing this. But then more and more and more happened. And then I even checked in with a girlfriend to be like, am I crazy? And she said, when you had me watching your daughter, when you went in to make lunch, I saw him make a pinky promise with her. And I asked her later, what was the pinky promise? And he was 26 years old. She was 6. And it was that after we got home from this trip, they were going to get together online and exchange and play games together. That is not normal behavior. And there were a bunch of other things too that I won't go into detail about. What ended up happening is when I expressed this to one of my friends, I'm really concerned about what I'm seeing. And she had shared it with her husband and they had a daughter the same age as my daughter. Instead of the husband coming to me and saying, what's going on? What are you seeing? What do we need to do here? He went and told this 26-year-old individual's father, basically, Jill is saying this about your kid. And the whole vacation blew up and the family yelled and screamed at me and they stormed out and they left. And I have basically lost several friends because of this incident. And it was this mind boggling. Yes, I understand that my history might make you think I'm paranoid, but also I'm a psychologist. I'm also a reasonable and psychologically minded adult. And you've known me for decades and I have never been anything but credible. I'm not paranoid, right? And the fact no one knew this person, he wasn't even supposed to be there. And so the fact that the rush to defend him over just getting curious and trying to figure out a way to make sure all the kids that were on this trip would stay safe was mind-blowing to me. I still to this day, this was years ago. My daughter's now almost 13. So this was a long time ago. And it's just so hard for me to make sense of the only way I've been able to make sense of it is if we acknowledge that this might have happened right under our noses and we had no idea, that means our kids might not have been safe. And I can't even let myself think about the fact that my kids aren't safe out in the world, even though the stats tell us that 1 in 3 girls is going to be sexually abused by the time they're 18. 1 in 3 and 1 in 6 boys, though they think that estimate is actually not accurate, that it's actually much higher than that, right? So we know what the stats say. And yet, even when we're seeing this in front of our eyes, we're like, nope, Jill must be crazy. This couldn't possibly be happening.
Jill, okay, so I have a question. I mean, this resonates, everything you just said resonates so hard with me, but like, and I also have, my daughter is 6 right now. Anyway, I believe and understand, that everything happened the way you did. What did the other adults say about, I mean, that like a 26-year-old asking to connect online with a 6-year-old, like, how is that? Like, how
that should be concerning to everyone.
Yeah, like that's
one data point should have been enough, and that was one of like 6 different things.
And what did they say? Were they just like, "Oh, that's no big deal. Like, how could you accuse him of this? Like, you're making too much of it." Like, what was, you remember? Like, what exactly was their like argument against that being an alarming behavior?
So the family, everyone related to this potential perpetrator kind of blew up and freaked out and stormed out and left. Everyone else that was left behind sat down at a table to talk about things and what was seen. And we all sort of patched things up, but there was never really an acknowledgement of like, oh, wow, yeah, you're right. That behavior all sounds super sketchy. There was like maybe one of my friends that kind of felt that way. And the rest were kind of like, oh, but he's so nice. Oh no, he's cool. He's really nice. This is a 26-year-old who was living at home without a job, had addiction issues. Not that any of those things make a person a pedophile, but there were a number of behaviors that had gone on, all of which I had shared. And I think there was definitely not, oh my God, thank you so much. You just kept all of our other children safe. I think they were like, we get why you feel this way, but we think he's fine.
Right. Well, Jill, I think you're spot on in your analysis of the why. And I this is something I think about all the time, because something that Mike and I have seen in this sort of like overarching narrative in the media about not just medical child abuse, but other forms of child abuse, right? Child sex abuse, but also we have come a long way on child sex abuse compared to where we were. And that's certainly something Mike can speak more directly to versus where we were. And we certainly have made no such progress about Munchausen by proxy. But I think we also still are bad at recognizing red flags for any child abuse. And I think it's for the reasons that you mentioned, right? Because we see so much pushback in the media of all this huge narrative about like false allegations of child abuse, right? Not just medical child abuse, but abusive head trauma, broken bones. There's this media narrative that these things are happening all the time, that the doctors are falsely accusing parents of this. There is no data, and I mean no data, to support that this is happening. Of course, does it happen? Sure, everything happens. But the data that we do have suggests that actually child abuse of all types is very underreported and that our system is very, very bad at holding parents accountable for it.
Well, and can I just jump in as a mandated reporter and speak for probably every listener of ours that's a mandated reporter? The last thing that we want to do is have to get on the damn phone with CPS. If you have ever had to call CPS or fill out a CPS report, no one has time to do this. If there is not a reasonable suspicion of abuse, trust me, nobody wants to be reporting abuse if abuse is not happening. If we're reporting it, it's because we have a pretty darn good reason to suspect that it's going on.
100%. And I mean, that is a thing. I think sometimes people really need to take a huge step back and just use their common sense. And just say usually people have a motivation to do what they're going to do. And people are not wanting to put their reputation on the line, inconvenience themselves, put themselves in an uncomfortable position. I mean, even just dealing with the bureaucracy of trying to report abuse, which I have also done, is a nightmare. So yes, there's no reason that people would be motivated to make false accusations. And nonetheless, that is the narrative that exists. And I've thought so much about why does this narrative, in things like Take Care of Maya or My Kicks and Bogs reporting, why does this hit with people? Why are people willing to believe something that is truly just makes no sense? And I think it's for the reasons that you nailed right there, Jill, is this notion that, especially if it's an abuser who seems nice, right? That guy seems normal. That guy seems nice. That guy didn't walk in and everyone got bad vibes immediately. Like, he doesn't seem creepy. He seems trustworthy. And I think it's especially hard with like moms, right? Because I think moms are people that we're sort of very, very programmed to think of as not only harmless, but as like helpers, right? And I think honestly, by and large, I don't think that's wrong, but like people want to live in a world where they believe that their children are going to be safe with the adults that are around them. And if you have to accept that not all adults are safe and that you're not going to immediately know the difference between a safe adult and an unsafe adult, that is a terrifying world. And in fact, it is much more comforting to live in a world of conspiracy theories, to live in a world where, oh, it's actually just this corrupt system. And, these child abuse pediatricians are getting payoffs from social services somehow that make this a financial incentive, which is truly the most preposterous piece of a whole preposterous pie that's being served to people. But child abuse pediatricians do not make good money for their work, let alone they do not get kickbacks of any kind. It's just like stupidest assertion ever. And yet somehow I think it's like the reason people believe it is because they're like, well, that just like intuitively feels better to think that there's some just like uncaring system. And like the systems are big and dysfunctional and kind of uncaring, just not in that way, right? It's more that like actually that they're let abusers get away with it because they're big and dysfunctional and uncaring, not that they are devoting the other thing is like the idea around false accusations is like the idea that the state, it's like, there's this idea that, well, the state has so much money and power and resources that it's just going after these parents. That's not something the state does. You like talk to prosecutors who've prosecuted these cases, like any child abuse cases. They don't have like resources to hire a bunch of experts to like, they don't have those resources. They don't get those resources dedicated to a case. It's like the idea that they would just be like, yeah, let's spend these resources going after a parent where there's nothing there is the most preposterous.
It's ludicrous.
Well,
it's ludicrous.
On more of the personal psychological basis, as I talk to psychologists and try to pretend I am one, when you let someone into your life, whether it's as a friend, whether it's as someone, your wife, someone you marry, friends on a trip, and you get to know that person however much, you have to get over a big psychological hurdle yourself. I've let this person become part of my life, and now they've done this. A lot of times I think it's easier for people to just say, I know her, she couldn't do that. I'm on her side. I don't care what you're going to show me. I can't be duped. I know people. I say all the time, denial is the strongest human emotion. And especially when it comes to these offenders, they'll blame it on doctors. Well, the doctor shouldn't have done the surgery. It's all the medication the doctor put the child on. Never mind, they did it because mom's telling them the child needs stuff. Just from that personal level, I think there's a lot of denial whenever you see that from these abusers. And the people on your trip that aren't your friends anymore, they were never your friends to begin with.
I'm going to reframe that, Mike, because having been in that seat, I would say people have really varying degrees of courage when it comes to facing this kind of thing. Yeah. And that's very disappointing information to have about those friends. And I think that like a friendship that I would say like a friendship that can't withstand the truth when the truth comes down to protecting children is probably not a friendship worth maintaining.
Well, let me also add something that I left out of the story, which is, and this might really be more of the reason that my friendships have suffered. We did sort of repair after that happened, but I don't throw this word around lightly. I truly felt traumatized. And one of the ways that I process my own trauma is through writing. And so I wrote an essay about this situation. And that was really the thing that I think my friends were like, why did you have to do that? But this is part of the reason I wanted to have this conversation with you guys is the idea that sunlight is the best disinfectant. And I am so tired of perpetrators being the ones that are getting the benefit of the doubt, that are the ones that are being believed, and everybody just hushing up about it. In fact, I wrote this beautiful quote. I recently listened to Christine Blasey Ford's memoir. She was, if you remember, she was the person who was sexually assaulted by Brett Kavanaugh, the Supreme Court Justice. And she said in her memoir, I'm going to read this quote to you. This is from her epilogue. I felt like I was supposed to stay quiet, and in many ways that would have been easier to do. Staying quiet serves my best interests and safety without a doubt, but it also serves the people who want me to stay quiet, and I'm not ready to give them that satisfaction. I also owe it to myself to break the silence. Oh, I'm getting choked up just reading that. I just thought that was so beautiful and powerful, and her coming forward literally ruined her life. Highly recommend the memoir for anyone who's interested. And so that was part of the reason that I wrote that essay is I wanted other people to read about what grooming looks like and the ways in which we might not trust ourselves, even when we are seeing something with our own eyes. And I will tell you, even though it really had a horrible impact in our friend group, I wrote this article, I think it's been 3 years now. I've had 5 different women find me on the internet and reach out to me because they had had similar experiences and they felt so incredibly alone and they didn't know what to do. They were all like sisters who had brothers who were pedophiles, which is what I was initially writing about. And they felt so alone and they didn't know where to turn and didn't have anyone. And so we were in touch and supported one another. And even one of the women ended up coming forward about her own abuse because I wrote that article and because we had created this little community of support with each other. And I just, for me, and you guys are doing this incredible work that is so frustrating so much of the time. But I think just really feels worth it when you see the way that it helps or supports the people that are suffering at the hands of these abusers.
Yeah. Oh, well, thank you so much for sharing that experience with us, Jill. That really resonates for me and certainly my experiences in the show. And that's why I came forward with my personal experience, right? That was not an easy choice to make. That was not an easy thing to do. It's something I wrestled with for years and years before doing it. It's something I had to have a lot of complicated conversations with my own family about. And we have heard from, at this point, honestly, thousands of people who've come forward with stories or come forward as survivors. And fortunately, it's not just me, taking all that in. And we have the folks at Munchausen support that are helping with all that triage, but it's really incredible. And it's sort of one of those things where you have to take the first step. And I think the risks can be really high. And it's really also interesting to me what you're saying about that assumption that people make, because people make this assumption about me all the time. Oh, Andrea, I don't think this is a terribly good faith criticism. And I think, honestly, people that say this about me probably have not actually listened to the show. But this assumption that okay, I have this thing in my personal life, so I just see it everywhere. And that's something where I'm I don't think people realize how hyper conscious I am of my own lens. That I will see someone post something, for example, online that it looks alarming to me. I don't think people should ever be posting pictures of their kids in the hospital or in medical situations online. However, I also recognize that the vast majority of people who are oversharing online, it's probably benign. I still don't think it's a thing people should do for lots of reasons with privacy
Right.
and just the ability for other people to take those images, all those things. Not a good idea. Please don't do it. But I recognize that most people who do that post about, their kid broke their arm or whatever, that's triggering for me. It doesn't mean it's necessarily a red flag. I am hyper aware that I see things through a certain lens. And especially if I'm talking about a case on the show, I have to be so sure of what I'm saying because the people I cover also are very litigious. So I really couldn't get away with just mapping this onto or projecting this onto the cases that I see. And so I think you do know, you have the intuitive sense to connect the dots when you've seen it before. And I think with grooming behaviors like the ones you're talking about, actually, you are the most equipped to see those things when they're in front of your eyes because you know what it looks like. And it's one of those things, something that Mike and I hear a lot. We're oh, these cases medical child abuse is so hard to diagnose. Actually, it's not. It's hard to prove in court, partially because the system is so resistant to learning anything about it and because it's a lot of work, right? It's a lot of work to get evidence that's going to hold up in court. All those things are true. It's not hard to see. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. And so I think the value, Jill, of spelling that out for other people and really taking that, emotional and potentially reputational risk of doing that is so important because it really gives other people the permission to stop gaslighting themselves, which I have to say, I think that there is something with women where, because like, this is something people bring up to me a lot, right? Where they're like, oh, like medical gaslighting is a real phenomenon. It is. Women often aren't believed about their own stories and their own versions of their own life. All true, 100%. That is not sort of what's happening in these cases. I mean, a lot of the people, and I don't know, Mike, if you feel like this, I would be interested in your take on the gender dynamics here about people who bring this to attention. Like, one of the things that you often say is that actually, like, some of the people who report on this behavior are like the new spouses of the like stepmoms and like the new women. That actually women are often the people who report this abuse also. So I think like that thing of like women are taught to like, oh, don't sort of make a fuss. Don't go ruin someone else's life with your gossip, whatever that sort of whole narrative actually is very present in these cases. Yeah.
Well, and I think women are also better at understanding female violence, and female violence as it's directed in child abuse, right? They're more equipped to see the manipulation. That's how come I like them on juries.
Well, I was going to say you talk about a case that a person who wasn't convicted because of a male juror was the one holdout who just couldn't believe that this mother would have done this to her kid. And the female jurors were all convicted.
Yeah, and then that jury was 10 females, 2 males. They were hung 10-2 for a full day. And then one of the males came around, and then one didn't. Interestingly enough, I think in his 60s male who was a dentist. And I kind of heard him mumble in the back of read the book. Y'all can read the book to find out.
Yeah. You'll get all the juicy details, and it is juicy. The other thing that comes to mind from a psychological standpoint is the just world theory that I think kind of fits here, which is this idea that we believe that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. So that when a bad thing happens to a good person, we really struggle to wrap our heads around it, because that just means the world is chaos. And so if a bad thing can happen to you and you're a good person, then a bad thing can happen to me and I'm a good person and it's not predictable and that's too scary. And that's where victim blaming comes from. Oh, you got raped because you were drunk and wearing a short skirt. And so as long as I don't get drunk and wear a short skirt, then I'm safe, right? So it's this way that we try to create control and certainty and a sense of safety and security in the midst of like what might actually be kind of unpredictable and chaotic if we really let ourselves think about that. And that's just hard for the human psyche to swallow.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Jill. And I think that is where, again, sort of one of the things that people project onto these cases is they really want to know, okay, if they have gotten to the point where they accept that someone is a perpetrator of this abuse, then they want to know, okay, what bad thing happened in this person's childhood that made them that way? And sometimes there's something. Most of the time, of the cases I've looked at, there isn't anything notable. In my case where it's a sibling, right? And we were very close in age. Just because I was there doesn't mean that I know every single thing that happened to my sister. It doesn't mean I know how she interpreted our family dynamics. Siblings are always raised in 2 slightly different families, even if it's the same family, right? There's a lot of nuance there. But in most of the cases that I've looked at, there's no like huge traumatic event, or it's not like all of these perpetrators come from abusive families or something like that. They often have siblings that are not, perpetrators of anything. And so there isn't that straight line. And I think the reason people are looking so hard for that is that exact impulse, right? Because they want to say like, okay, if I don't do X, Y, Z, I can make sure that my child does not grow up to be that. And that, or this isn't going to happen in my family because of this. They really want to hold it at a distance. And so I think that is very disquieting to hear from someone like me, where I say like, nope, I had a really nice upper middle class upbringing. ACE scores very low, all that kind of thing.
Right.
Where it's like, and this happened to my family. And I think that's very alarming. And that's the reason I shared it.
Yeah. And it's back to what you were saying earlier too, is like, you want to think that you'll be able to spot the monsters. And if you can't, then this could happen to anyone at any time. And that feels really scary. I have a question for both of you. When I was reading the book, it was fascinating and such a great read. And there were multiple times where I was feeling so frustrated for you. I was just thinking, Mike, you especially, like, you have put so much work into these cases over so many years and met so many obstacles. And I just was thinking for both of you, like, how do you keep fighting? Like, what keeps you from throwing in the towel and being like, forget it? That's just too much of an uphill battle.
Well, for me, unfortunately and fortunately, I guess I'm a pretty stubborn individual. Now, that can be a good trait, and that can be a bad trait. And I also know what life is going to be like for these children if no one does anything. It will be a childhood of abuse. These offenders don't quit. If I charge them in our DA's office, because in Tarrant County, the DA's office handles the CPS cases and the criminal prosecution. And if they don't do their job, which oftentimes occurs, they just recently dismissed the case that was pending for 5 years and really gave me no excuse for doing it. Prosecutorial discretion, and we don't think we can prove it. Well, you didn't even read the case. But anyway, yeah, I know what is going to come down the pipe for these kids throughout childhood, if they make it out of childhood. And am I going to live with that? I'm going to do everything I'm supposed to. I can't force prosecutors to do their job, but as in that case that I just spoke about, and as I have in other cases, if they don't, I will let them know in documented government email. That is, Andrea, available by Freedom of Information request. I let them know what they have sentenced that child to, what they have sentenced them to by not trying. And, for the first 7 years of my career, I had a very good DA's office. I don't want to seem like I'm knocking the DA's office. It was very seasoned. They relished the hard case. They weren't worried about losing a case. And unfortunately, that office currently, a lot of the attorneys over there are afraid to lose the case. And if there's any chance of losing, they're going to plea it really light and leave the child with the abuser, or they're going to dismiss the case. And that's a culture that they're going to take. That culture was destroyed, and it's going to take a while to build back, if they build it back at all. And if they have the people in place to build it back, which I don't know that they do.
I mean, that was really clear in the book, is what a difference a good DA's office makes. I mean, you got some really great convictions when you had people there working together and supporting and believing, and then everything fell apart when that changed. So maybe this is the same question, but I'm curious then, maybe the answer to this question is I send off this government email, but when you know you're right and nothing happens, how do you let go? You might be able to tell from the story I told you about this trip, it's been 7 years, and I have to admit, I have not done a very good job of being able to let go. And I have a Google alert set to this individual's name so that the day he finally gets caught, I will be able to do the world's biggest I told you so dance that you have ever seen in your entire life.
I mean, this work has taken over my entire career. So I'm not really sure I'm the best person to give you advice on letting something go.
Right.
I guess the answer is you don't. You don't, but you keep fighting. You keep fighting. You use the fire in your belly to keep fighting.
I mean, why should you ever let it go? And I will say this. There are many fights across the board that feel difficult and that feel hopeless. And I think I have learned so much about this in the last 5 years of my life that I've really been involved with this. And after this situation has been in my life for coming up on 14 years with my own family, and the profound feelings of hopelessness that I encountered after 2 investigations where the people that could have put a stop to this abuse in my own family failed, and, with varying degrees of culpability. And when I got involved, when I met Mike, when I met Dr. Mark Feldman, who was also on the show with me, the feeling that I could do something, that there was, for me as a storyteller, as a person who is versed in media communications, that I could help at all, was so empowering that that is what has motivated me. And then in the 2 years that the show has been on the air, seeing the reception, seeing the community that's coalesced around it, giving us a vehicle to have support systems for survivors, for dads, for families that are going through this. My colleagues that have participated in that, people who have been so brave to sit on the mic with me, people like Dr. Sally Smith, people like Joe, who was the subject of our 4th season, who was, a survivor's story has never really been featured like that. People have taken such incredible risks to report things to me both on the mic and off. There's a lot that happens every time we feature a case that people do not see. It is so moving. It's so encouraging for all that Mike and I see. So many people who are cowards, who look the other way, who don't do their jobs. We see plenty of that. We also see incredible, inspiring acts of bravery, people who do the right thing, people who take huge risks. And those are very moving. And what we hear from survivors is, even if the outcome is not what you would want, which is for that child to be safe and not raised in a house where they are abused, that is not the usual outcome, right? We know very few cases, unfortunately, on the whole, where survivors are separated from their abusers. Most of the cases we hear about from survivors, maybe there was attempts, maybe those reached the court, maybe they didn't, but they were not. They were raised by their abuser. And we know that for those survivors, when they end up on that odyssey of trying to figure out what happened to them, it means something that people tried.
Yeah.
They know that
point.
There were adults who witnessed what was happening to them and stood up for them, and that thought their life was worth protecting. And also, those interventions, we know, can at least temporarily de-escalate the abuse and can mean the difference between life and death. Many of the cases that we have covered on this show, including my sister's, when you look at the evidence in that case, they were heading towards a fatality. And those doctors stopped it.
Yeah.
And those children are alive because of it. And that is not small. Didn't work out the way that we would have wished. Perpetrator wasn't held accountable. Kids ended up back in the house, but they're alive. And I think it's so important for us not to give up on abuse victims. Yes, these children are going to be very, very, very impacted by this abuse. Does not mean that they cannot grow up, heal, be good people and
normal
members
lives
of society and all of that, right?
Yeah.
It's like we have to value those adult lives too, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, if I didn't believe that, I couldn't keep this up, right? And I think that sunlight is such a powerful disinfectant, and it's such a powerful call to those children that are covered on the show of listen, you're going to hear the voices of the people who saw. You're going to hear the voices of the people who stood up for you, including me, right? I mean, my heart is so in this because of my niece and nephew, and because I want them to be able to find their way back to me if they ever so choose, and to know that a lot of people tried, a lot of people cared.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was just sitting here thinking. I was thinking of Mr. Rogers, Find the Helpers. And then I was thinking, I so hope that when your niece and nephew are old enough to make sense of this on their own, they'll come back to you and your parents and understand truly what actually happened, and that they did have people there that were trying to be in their corner. And I will say, for my story, as much as it was traumatic and terrible and all the things that happened, and I probably could have handled it better than I did, at the end of the day, I protected my child from harm, and I would do it all over again 1,000 times, 1,000,000 times.
I think so too. And that hullabaloo, that might have disincentivized that perpetrator, at least temporarily, right? It's you don't know, bringing it to light, but making a fuss over it. Yeah, that's going to be really uncomfortable for you. But people should be made uncomfortable when that is happening. It's amazing to me sometimes that other parents are just walking around in the world where they're not thinking about child abuse all day the way that I am. But it must be nice. But also that's not my view on the world. That is the world. That is the world.
That's right.
It just is.
And nobody wants to be the person that says, I don't believe you when you say your kid has cancer. Nobody wants to be the person that says, I think you might be a pedophile. No one wants to do that. Like you said, it's so incredibly uncomfortable. So I think if we have a call to action for our listeners, it's this willingness to do the uncomfortable thing and to prioritize the needs and safety of vulnerable children, because it's better to question and be wrong than not question and be wrong and have children who are hurt.
100%. 100%. We should always err on the side of protecting the child.
Yeah. Well, I see we're at the end of our time. Any last minute things that we didn't talk about, that I didn't ask you about, that you feel would be really important for our listeners to hear?
Systems are people. Whatever I hear anyone say, well, that's just the system. Well, no, that's someone in the system who didn't do their job. And it's so important to have people more interested in doing the right thing than interested in self-protection, especially in our law enforcement systems. Don't let someone tell you, well, the system's just terrible. Well, no, that's people inside the system. And people inside the system need to be accountable. Yeah.
And be the squeaky wheel.
Exactly.
And maybe they'll get so sick of you that they'll do what you want them to do and look into it.
And if you're a person that's feeling like newly activist-y motivated by this conversation, most of the time, DAs, prosecuting attorneys, those people are elected officials. Sheriffs, those people are elected officials. And part of the problem here is that children don't vote, but you are a person as an adult who can vote in support of those children and the children in your community. And that is something that people need to pay attention to local politics. That is a place where we can all have a huge impact.
Great point. All right. Well, let's end there. The book, again, is called The Mother Next Door, Medicine, Deception, and Munchausen by Proxy. It's a terrific read. If people want to find you two, find out more about you, what's the best place that they can find you?
So if you want to find out more about me, so the podcast, Nobody Should Believe Me, we are now in our 5th season. That can be found anywhere you listen to podcasts. You can find more out about me and the book at AndreaDunlop.net. And I'm also on Instagram at Andrea Dunlop.
And you can find out more about me at MikeWeberConsulting.com. I offer training for all disciplines that will touch this abuse. And that training is a comprehensive training from what to do from the time a case of this abuse lands on your desk all the way through criminal prosecution.
I've been to a Mike training. I've been to a couple of them, actually. Can personally vouch for their efficacy. It's great.
I love it. Well, if any of our listeners are in law enforcement or healthcare, go talk to the people at the top of the system and see if you can get that going where you're at. Guys, this was such a great conversation. Thank you so much for being here. I really enjoyed our time together.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us, Jill.
Okay, listeners, hopefully you're still with us at the end of that episode. And now Emily and I are going to chat about our thoughts in our first ever POTC debrief. So Emily, I'll throw it to you.
Yeah, so I messaged Jill as I was listening and said, I have so many thoughts. And of course, we don't have time for all of them. But one thing I wanted to share is my own experience working in children's hospitals with pediatric medical teams and families, and that I did have a case of medical child abuse that I worked very closely with. And I wanted to share my experience of how incredibly complicated this was. Now, first, I had worked with the family for 2 years before I even had an inkling that something might be amiss. And come to find out later that the average time for a child medical abuse case to come to the surface is 5 to 7 years of medical treatment. So you all discussed this and how hard it is, but I really could see why.
Well, what was it about your experience that made it take so long? I mean, one of the things we talk about in the episode is, of course, nobody wants to be the one to question, especially in light of what we know about women and mothers and people of color experiencing medical gaslighting. You don't want to question a suffering person's report. And it's our job really to support them and advocate for them. And so I imagine that's part of it, is you're not going to start out being skeptical and questioning. You're going to assume that what you're being told is true. And so what did it take for that to transition for you?
You're right. I mean, that's where the huge tension is. And as a psychologist on a medical team, that was my job in many ways, was to be an advocate for the family and their experience of what they're going through, and not just the focus of their medical problems and medical symptoms. I was there to represent the entire human experience of going through having medical conditions and diseases. And so I spend most of my time aligning with families and promoting their voices. And so it's so disorienting to have it be flipped, where I need to actually question the voice of the family. And in this experience, there actually ended up being a specific lab result that was a discrepancy from previously reported lab findings that we realized we had no record of. And I had the opportunity to observe this child's functioning on a daily basis and was realizing that the impairment and symptoms that kept being reported didn't match what I was seeing, and that the child actually appeared to be functioning really well. And this is an important note. In the context where I was working, the child was there all day without mom.
Well, that's something that Mike and Andrea talk extensively about in the book that we talk about in the episode. Is this is really one of those big hallmark indicators.
Yes.
Is if the child suddenly starts to do better in the absence of the alleged perpetrator, that is something that really needs to be paid attention to. And in all the cases they talk about on the podcast, in the book, 100% of the time that was the case. And yet it still wasn't enough for them to be believed that this was really ongoing or taken seriously. You know, there would be family members that would allow the child to be back in contact with the perpetrating parent. And of course, the kid would tank, and they had the sneakiest ways of even slipping in, I don't know, toxins or different things to make the child sick. And it can get really complicated and intense. So what ended up happening with this case? Did you run into resistance from family members or other providers? Did it end up getting prosecuted? What happened?
So this was many years ago, but what I remember is I remember the care conference where there were at least 15 of us providers, including the child abuse team at the hospital, sitting at the table, going over records and reports. And part of what flagged this whole situation as abuse was my communication with another psychologist at another institution once we compared notes. And after we had that big meeting and we were all on the same page and everyone could see what was happening, the family left and relocated out of state. And the paper trail is officially lost.
Right. So this is probably still ongoing in another state, in another hospital. And if the people in that hospital clue into it, then they'll go move on to another hospital. And that's one of the many things that makes these cases so incredibly challenging. And I think what I take away from this conversation, you and me, Emily, as well as the conversation I had with Andrea and what I shared about my own experiences, is especially when you have more than one set of credible eyes, you know, seeing what they say they are seeing, that this should be a massive red flag. And at the very least, anyone who cares about protecting children should be willing to get curious, even if that is the harder thing to do.
Yes. I think that's the perfect place to end, because that's where this is so painful for me as a child health professional. I am so closely connected to children's vulnerabilities and their well-being, and how caregiver harm damages children so deeply that it is really hard to reconcile not protecting those children if we have the knowledge.
Absolutely.
So thank you so much for doing this conversation. I think it's a really important discussion.
Thank you. I will admit, I think I'm going to have a vulnerability hangover after this one. I shared a lot more than I usually do, but even so, I'm going to ask listeners, if you found this conversation helpful and you want to be part of shining sunlight as a natural disinfectant, please do share this episode with your friends and loved ones. Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock. If you enjoy our podcast, you can help us out by leaving a review or contributing on Patreon.
You can get more psychology tips by subscribing to our newsletter and connecting with us on social media.
We'd like to thank our podcast production manager, Jadine Stout-Williams.
This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and is not meant to be a substitute for mental health treatment. If you're looking for mental health treatment, please visit the resources page of our website, offtheclockpsych.com.